Good morning and welcome to today's WINspirational. My name is Mishka Baltzum and I'm the CEO of the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce. We are pleased that you're able to join us this morning, and a very special thank you to our guest, Dr. Kate Bensanson. WINspirational has historically been an event that took place in the evening with a glass of wine in one hand, some delicious appetizers on tables nearby, somewhere at one of Niagara's amazing local venues. But if the past 8 months have taught us anything, it is that we are resilient and can adapt to new and different formats and still have important dialogues about how this time has changed how we live, how we work, how our societies will function, and likely how it will reshape our collective priorities. This gathering is part of WIN's, Women in Niagara Council's programming focus on fostering the growth and success of women in business in Niagara. WIN is committed to providing women with opportunities to succeed and thrive, and this is likely more important than ever. It is my great pleasure to pass this event over to Julie Roersen, our chair of WIN Council. Julie currently works as the manager of community relations at Brock University. She's involved in the community as vice president of the YWCA Niagara and founder of Niagara Leadership Summit for Women, which just wrapped up its 7th annual conference last week. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Mishka, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of the WIN Council, thank you for taking your coffee break with us today. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my fellow council members who may be here with us today: Grace Eldajani, Leslie Calvin, Isabel Camillo, Josie Fassini, Cheryl Johnson, Nora Kalb, Cheryl Matthews, Sarah Pertula, Nicole Regier, Melanie Sotka, Jamie Turner, Ruth Unruh, Cheryl Vanditelli, and Marcia Young. If you're here, just give us a wave in the chat. It's great to see some of our council members out today. We have a really strong council and members across all of Niagara. We're here to foster the growth and support the success of women in business in Niagara. WIN Council provides strategic advice to the GNCC on issues that are relevant to women in Niagara. We host events to educate, celebrate women's accomplishments in business, like the upcoming WeBuzz we have in November. We run a peer-to-peer mentorship program, and we also host events like today's WINspirational to talk about the challenges facing women in Niagara and have a dialogue about solutions and opportunities. Some of you have been to our WINspirational events in the past that Mishka mentioned. And yes, this one is quite different, not only because it's 10 a.m. and we're sipping coffee instead of wine and doing this virtually, but also because very obviously I am not Ruth Unruh, who is our regular interviewer and founder of WIN Council. Many of you know Ruth and her familiar voice from events like these. I have really big shoes to fill today, and that's saying something because I have big feet. But Ruth is taking a break from her WINspirational role as she goes through treatments for breast cancer. And because it is October, it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. On behalf of Ruth, I want to ask all of you to please, ladies, check your breasts, get a mammogram, support women in your network who are going through breast cancer, and support each other as we always do. Ruth is here today, and we look forward to seeing her in the Ruth booth again. Now, these events are about women's journeys in business and leadership. And another way that today's event is going to be a bit different is because we are not just learning from an individual woman's experience, but through the lens of policy. Yes, we're going to talk about policy, but I can promise you it's not going to be boring. We're taking this approach because there are very real threats to the gains for equity that have been made over the last 50, 60 years because of the pandemic. And there are lingering inequities for women and minorities and racialized folks that have been highlighted and punctuated because of the pandemic. And while this is coloring every aspect of our lives, this is also an opportunity to think about how we can do things differently, create new frameworks, new policies for the future. And today we're talking to an expert who has gained national prominence for her work to further gender equality in Canada, a woman who's based right here in Niagara. We're going to have a chat and we're going to take your questions too. So please share them in the chat as we continue our conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce BDC, our sponsor for today, the Business Development Bank of Canada. And welcome, Jennifer Clark.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Clark, the Hamilton Business Center Manager and Women Entrepreneur Champion at BDC. For those of you who don't know BDC, we are the bank for Canadian entrepreneurs. We provide financial support, tools, and advice to businesses at all stages of growth, and we have made it a priority to support women entrepreneurs. We are proud to work with the Greater Niagara Chamber as a sponsor of today's WINspirational event and look forward to the insights shared by Dr. Kate Bensanson. Although the pandemic has changed the way people come together for events like this, creating connections is more important than ever, because right now, nothing is normal. The pandemic is impacting every person and every business, but its effects are not equal. Women across the country are seeing a significant impact. We know women are having a harder time returning to work due to childcare issues. They tend to start businesses in the sectors hardest hit by the pandemic, including hospitality and retail. And they're having a harder time bringing back their staff. It's been a hard road and the journey is not over, but Canadian entrepreneurs are responding with resilience and strength. Every day I connect with women business owners who are working harder, pivoting, changing, brainstorming, doing whatever they can to keep their business afloat, and it's awesome to see. It's not easy, it never was, but working together we can make it easier, and that's what BDC is here for. We provide the financial support, tools, and advice to Canadian businesses from coast to coast at all stages of growth. In 2015, the bank launched a plan to support women entrepreneurs, and they remain a priority today. In 2018, we doubled our lending target to women entrepreneurs to $1.4 billion by 2021, and we are so close to achieving it ahead of schedule. We made this commitment not just because it's the right thing to do, but because diversity and inclusion make good business sense. We are stronger when we have more women-owned and women-led businesses. In fact, research shows time and time again that companies with diverse leadership teams deliver higher profits, more revenue, and better innovation. We want to help. On bdc.ca, you will find countless free articles and resources to help you grow your business. This includes our Entrepreneurship Learning Center, and that has free courses on almost every business topic from operations and finance and marketing and HR. We also offer financing and advice. Sometimes you need a partner to help you see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what our advisory services team can help with. They offer practical advice and roundtable events to help entrepreneurs solve their business challenges, and I'd recommend reaching out for a consultation. At the end of the day, while you can probably do it alone, it will be easier with the support of others. Over the years, there's one piece of advice every women entrepreneur I speak to can agree on, and that is making connections with other female entrepreneurs and business leaders helps you drive your business further, faster. So be sure to ask for help when you need it and offer it when you can. I wish you all a productive and inspiring day. Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kate Bensanson. Dr. Bezanson is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Associate Dean of Social Sciences at Brock University. Dr. Bezanson specializes and advises in areas of social, family, and labor market policy, gender, care, public law, political economy, and federalism. In pandemic, she was focused her policy attention on social infrastructure as a key lever for economic recovery, with a focus on childcare in particular. An avid runner and self-declared policy nerd, she lives in St. Catharines with her partner, 2 sons, and a mildly bitey 3-month-old. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Kate Bensanson.
Welcome, Kate. Thank you for being here.
Hello. I should clarify, it's a 3-month-old puppy. I do not have a 3-month-old human.
Oh, that's fun. You have a very impressive resume among being a mother, a puppy mom. Didn't you also just finish a law degree?
I did also, yes. I think it's an affliction, but I really felt I needed to add another dimension, especially constitutional and public law, to my policy repertoire. So as a serious grown-up, as a tenured faculty member, I went back and did an LLM in constitutional law at Osgoode.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that. So can you tell us about yourself, your background, where you're from, and how did you come to study these heavy topics of federalism and gender and social policy? So important.
I know, and sounds so incredibly boring. So I'll try to make it a little lively. I guess I'll start though by acknowledging that I'm greeting you today, and we're sort of meeting virtually on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg peoples, and the gathering place of many nations. And it is my honor and privilege to now live in this part of the world. I grew up in and around Ottawa, and I'll sort of explain how I arrived at this series of adjectives to describe this thing that I've been studying for what I feel like most of my life, which is really how do people put together the necessities of life? That's the overarching question that I've been asking myself for a really long time. So in a weird way, I would say, I mean, everybody has an origin story of why they came to focus on something. When I was 13, my family and I moved to Latin America. We moved to Peru. My dad at the time was working for what was then called External Affairs, now became Foreign Affairs. Anyway, it has many different names. And we moved to Peru, and this was right at a time when many people, or many of those who are old as I am, will recall that there was a significant debt crisis, and especially in Latin America, in Africa, and most of the global South. And we arrived at a point of transition. So there was a new government in power. And so there was this huge external debt. And what they tried to do initially was to say, okay, for us to meet all of our costs and our obligations, we're going to practice a policy called import substitution. So instead of saying, you know, Julie, I'm going to import wheat from Canada and, you know, I don't know, sorghum from Nigeria, they tried to produce those materials internally. And it was sort of an isolationist policy, but it was a real attempt to bolster the economy. It very quickly gave way to the kind of policies that I think all of us are now really familiar with, which were at the time called structural adjustment policies. We might think about them as sort of austerity or neoliberalism policies as they moved north. And as those policies took effect, and as I was sort of observing all of this and coming into some kind of intellectual consciousness, I realized that the kind of cuts in social spending, changes in taxation policy, focus on export-led growth bore with enormous severity, especially on women, especially on Indigenous and African Peruvians, and always, always, always on children. And so what I began to witness around me, but couldn't articulate and didn't have the vocabulary to really put into words, was the effect of macroeconomic policy decisions, international relations, and then of course the kind of lived experience of social policy. And for me, it was sort of the beginning moment where I really understood that when income enters households, there's decision-making that happens, and there are power imbalances in households, there are power imbalances in labor markets, there are power imbalances in caregiving. And at the micro level, that has real impacts on individual people's lives, but that accumulates to the macro level, and we start to see these huge patterns of inequality. So, you know, as a 13-year-old, obviously I couldn't articulate that, but it sort of set me on a course towards thinking about that. And then I moved around a lot after that. Obviously, I lived my dad didn't stay in Latin America, so I lived in the United States, in and around Washington, D.C., and I came back to Canada just as the Reagan administration was in power in the US when I was there, and then we were moving to free trade in Canada, the Mulroney years, and the kind of moving towards a kind of sort of style of structural adjustment policy. So the ideas followed me in policy terms. Mm-hmm. Long answer.
That's great. I think even as a 30-something, I don't necessarily have all those words to describe the situations that you just talked about seeing and experiencing as a young person, and we still don't. So it's very important. So through all of that, what was your politicization moment? When did you, if you do, when did you become a feminist?
Oh, that's such a good question.
I think so.
I'm having Perrier instead of coffee, but you know, we could be having wine when the pandemic is over. I think there are several. There are two that really stand out for me. One was, again, when I was very young. I think I was maybe 14 or 15, and we were living in Lima, and I have no idea where I was going, but we were driving somewhere. And I saw an accident on the road, and we drove past. And as I looked over, somebody took a newspaper and put it over the body of what turned out to be a child on the road. And it was part of, I was beginning a process of beginning to understand the kinds of both economic and structural social inequalities that existed both in the global South and of course around the world. And I remember having a conversation, I can't remember who it was with, but it was essentially that if you didn't have cash, there was no ambulance that was going to come. And it was an Indigenous child in a family that was precariously housed. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was a beginning moment where I began to understand in a way that I sort of hadn't understood before, the ways in which global relations and relations between the global North and the global South structured the opportunities of people around the world, and also the ways in which structural racism and the history of colonialism played itself out in a child who was not that much younger than I was. And it was, one of those moments that led me down a path towards understanding those kinds of structural social inequalities and tragedies. And then I think for me, the cementing moment of feminism, which is a story I think that it would be the same if you, I'm making myself sound so old, really. I don't know, I don't feel very old. But for most Canadian women, I think my age at the time, I was living in Washington, D.C. when the Montreal Massacre happened. And I had a friend of mine, an American friend, who called me and said, there's a guy shooting, girls at a university in Canada. And I turned on the news, and it was one of those moments that I realized that there were huge risks to being a smart, outspoken girl, that it could be life-threatening to be ambitious and be female. And for me, that was one of those turning point moments where I began to put a lot of pieces together and to really question the narrative at the time, which was, when it's familiar to many of us, this was just a crazy guy. He was, he had difficult family life. There was a whole narrative that emerged about the individual. And then there was a really strong counter voice that was emerging that was saying, no, this is part of a much more significant and deeply rooted kind of social manifestation of misogyny in its most extreme form. And this is an expression of it, but it's not an individual affliction. It reflects a broader social affliction. So I think for me, that led me on it consolidated a lot of the thinking that I was doing before around the kind of structural bases of the kinds of inequalities that exist, and certainly propelled my thinking as I moved into university.
Right. I think a lot of us, you've had a unique experience growing up, living in different countries, and through your family's experiencing, viewing that through a lens of politics and policy. But many of us, I think, when we travel, we open our eyes, we think about things, but then don't necessarily have the opportunity to come back and do the research and dig into that. But I think that's why conversations like this and talking with each other are really important. Mm-hmm. So pivoting into your research and how you have used that, those learning opportunities throughout your life to influence your academic career, you really do a great job of this, of translating your academic research into clear language that we can all understand. Can you tell us about that work and what you've been studying and researching the last few years?
Oh, sure. So I think one of the things that I learned really early on was that if you can't explain what it is you're thinking and working on in terms that are really easily translatable to most people, you're probably talking to a pretty small audience. And there's a really, it's important for academics to drill down into details and challenge each other on our methodologies and on our findings and our approaches. But I think my approach has always been that it behooves me, if I'm going to especially look at social policy, especially if I'm going to be thinking about how do we understand power imbalances, that it shouldn't be something that I'm just talking to a few people about. I should find ways to share that more generally. So, and it's not a skill that I think we're certainly taught in university. In fact, I think the obverse is true. But I had this hugely wonderful opportunity when I was a graduate student, when I was doing my PhD, to work with an organization called the Caledon Institute of Social Policy. And one of the missions of the Caledon was to do that kind of policy translation. And so professionally, I had the opportunity to kind of, get trained a little bit in getting rid of a lot of semicolons and trying to find the fanciest word that I could find to describe something when, a really nice short word would actually do and do better. So I feel like I owe a huge debt to that experience, because it gave me a lot of those tools, and it instilled in me a sense that if what I was doing didn't really have, sort of broad import, I'm not sure why I was spending a huge amount of time on it. So that's a bit of a backstory to the work that I've been doing and why I think the knowledge translation piece is there. I'd say, honestly, I've spent all this time, like really since I was a kid, trying to figure out how do people put together the necessities of life and what gets traded off, right? So I sort of arrived in grad school thinking about policy, thinking about labor markets, thinking about sort of macroeconomics, thinking about structural adjustment and international development and all of these things. And what I was really trying to sort out is, how do people take care of each other? Like, what does that look like? And it happens in all kinds of ways. So the questions that I've always really been asking are, how does the work of the daily and generation reproduction of people happen, and how does it get shifted, right? So, it happens in families. We know that, but that work, which a lot of scholars call social reproduction, we could call care work, blah, blah, blah. It happens in families, but we also see that it happens through states. So states will take on some of that work. So it's not families who are providing primary health care, it's hospitals, and we fund some of that. We fund education. It's not happening in families. So the work of social reproduction, of the daily and generational formation and maintenance of people, happens in different sites. It also happens in the market. We provide care for a price. You can pay for, childcare services. You can pay for long-term care provision. There are all kinds of care services that are paid services, so it can get shifted to the market. And of course, we also know it can get shifted to what we would call the third sector, or the not-for-profit sector, or the charity sector. And that also the provision of, care, social reproduction, the necessities of life, all of those things. So, it's sort of that sort of diamond-shaped puzzle of how does care get shifted. And we know that, sometimes it gets reprivatized to households, and usually to women's labor into households to take on, because it's cheaper to do it that way, right? But, sometimes it just gets shifted to the market to provide it for a price, or as a last resort, it might be shifted to charities. And so all of those pieces have been the ones in different contexts, in different countries, at different levels, at the level of the national economy or the level of a household, I've been trying to sort of grapple with. And what became really clear to me in thinking about all of this is there are always threshold effects, right? We know what it looks like when that care architecture fails. We see household dissolution. We see children taken into care. We see that failing to invest in households has huge effects, not just on those households, but on the societies in which those households live, on the economy, and so on. So the kind of policy interests that I've had have really been about, how do you create at the household level, at the meso level, sort of the state and the firm and markets, and at the macro level of the economy and international trade, how do you figure out what that mix is so that you're investing in that social reproduction work in a way so that you don't get those threshold effects, that you don't get the kind of things that we all end up paying for? I mean, we pay for incorrections, what we fail to pay to invest in at earlier stages in social policy. We pay for them regardless, right? So it's a choice about the kind of social outcomes and economic outcomes that we want. So all of that is sort of a complicated way of saying I arrive at policy as part of this larger landscape. And for me, in the Canadian context, what I've really focused a lot of my attention on, at least in the last 10 years, have been transitions to parenthood. So especially around, how do you put together the necessities of life when you have especially a new small human in your life? How do gender divisions of labor happen in households? We know that in households, before there's a baby, the gender division of labor, and if we're talking about heterosexual households between men and women, tends to be pretty even. And then a baby arrives and those negotiations happen, and those negotiations reflect what's happening more broadly in the economy as well. And we start to see an entrenchment of gender divisions of labor. We start to see changes in labor market attachment. We start to see the kind of glass ceilings that we all know very well in terms of women's promotion, and the pipeline issues really start to emerge. So I've been interested in how couples navigate that, but then what is the social policy architecture around them? So what's the childcare architecture? What are the opportunities for parental leave, maternity leave, adoption leave? What are the workplace arrangements that are in place? And then, of course, I'm always really interested in the kind of broader labor market regulations that exist. And that's a little bit boring, so I don't have to go into that. But all of that exists in this crazy constitutional federation that we have in Canada that says most of the messy, fleshy, difficult stuff of everyday life is a provincial responsibility. So if we think, the Constitution says this is Section 91, this is, then Section 92, provincial and federal responsibilities. The federal stuff is, military, trade, money, and the provincial stuff is healthcare, labor, childcare, education, fleshy, messy, everyday, difficult stuff. So when we think about our federation, in a weird way, it's kind of gendered. It's like the provinces and territories largely have, we think about it, they have women, they have kids, they have domestic violence, they have all of those other things. So for me, the federalism questions are also animated by a kind of dynamic of social reproduction that gets played out on the constitutional stage, and in pandemic has been very interesting to observe. So, the law piece has factored into this, of course, because I spent all this time sort of going, well, we need this stuff, we should make changes. But I didn't have the technical tools to say, how do we understand what kind of legislative process we need? What are the regulatory conditions that we need to think about the whole range of architecture around social reproduction, around labor markets, and so on? And then how do we understand the kind of constitutional challenges in Canada that we have around developing really good and lasting social policy that can deal with a whole range of things, including gender inequality? That was a long answer, sorry, Julie.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. And I have to say, in full disclosure, I'm a political science grad. So to me, this is familiar and very interesting. But I know for a lot of folks, like I said, you do a great job of translating those big words, the academic study, into clear language. And I think through the last 8 months, through this pandemic, we've been having a lot of these conversations around the dinner table, right? About the struggle, about the balance, about the need. And now the work that you're doing and the conversation that we're having today, I think it gives us an opportunity as women in Niagara to think about that from the lens of public policy. Just like you've described, we have these situations, life exists in this way, and how does policy both influence and impact that? So over the summer, a lot of us have seen you on our TV screens and read your name in traditional media talking about hard and soft infrastructure. Can you tell us what that means, define that, and how it impacts men and women differently?
For sure, and that's a great question, and thank you, Julie. You're very complimentary, and I have to say it's such a pleasure to get to spend some time with you today.
Ditto, absolutely, thank you.
So one of the things that we traditionally think when we go into a recession, so we think about the 2008 recession, which is probably the most vivid in our minds of recent recessions. And it was a recession that emanated from the financial sector. And in a typical recession, such as the one in 2008, what you tend to see is a contraction in traditionally male employment. So you especially see a contraction in manufacturing. And the remedies that governments can deploy in terms of stimulus spending and trying to grow the economy out of that recessionary period are what we think of as, what we've called in the past infrastructure spending, which is interesting. We don't call it hard infrastructure spending, we call it infrastructure spending. So, there were, if you remember 2008, there were all of those signs all over the place for infrastructure investments by the federal government. And they were usually, your roads, your bridges, shovel in the ground projects. And roads and bridges are hugely important and they stimulate employment. And this is certainly a tool that is needed to get us through recessionary periods. But this is not a recession like the 2008 recession. In 2008, it was actually women's labor market participation that largely got us through. So women increased their labor market participation in the sectors that have been really hard hit in this particular pandemic to make up for offsets in male unemployment. In this recession, it's a health-induced recession, as we know, and particularly know in Niagara, it has hit particular sectors very hard. The retail sector, accommodations, the tourism sector, Niagara has faced its very fair share of challenges. So those sectors have been particularly hard hit. We also know that women are significantly employed in those sectors and that they are often lower wage workers in those sectors. And we see from the labor force data that it's low wage workers, it is youth, it's racialized people, and it's especially those at the lowest end of the hourly earning scale who have not recovered and whose incomes are stalling through what I was hoping was a recovery trajectory, but now, looking at the case counts in Ontario and in Quebec, and certainly looking at Europe and in the US, I fear that we are going to return to a period of contraction. So we see that in this particular pandemic, women were the first called or pushed out of the labor market as a result of both caregiving responsibilities as schools and childcare centers closed, but also because of the sectors in which they worked. And we're facing a situation where in lots of ways women are going to be the first out and the last back, especially for women with young children. Their labor market return and their hours worked stalled all the way through August. There was some return in September. It's not clear what's going to happen in October, and the return in September, I think, is largely owing to schools reopening. But we have a very uncertain landscape. So we have those labor market conditions that in July, the Royal Bank of Canada analyzed and said that Canadian women's labor market participation and attachment had reached a 30-year low. So we've gone back to the 1980s and early 1990s. We face the prospect of a gender regressive recovery. And we know that, the longer you're out of the labor market, the bigger the hit in terms of those pipeline advancements, in terms of earnings, and also, of course, in terms of lifetime risk of poverty. So we have all of that, and we have these tools that governments are trying to look at and say, what do we do when we're faced with economic crisis and recession? Well, this is not the 2008 recession. And so it doesn't call for a huge stimulus in traditional male employment in those kinds of infrastructure projects that we would have done previously. Now, I would have been critical in 2008 and say, why are we only spending on infrastructure that stimulates traditionally male employment? But given the landscape of what my colleague Armin Yelnitsin is calling a she-cession, or others are calling a pink collar recession, it calls for very different tools. And one of the biggest tools that I and my lovely team of colleagues have been advocating for since March is a social infrastructure-led recovery. And a social infrastructure-led recovery is one in which the investments are in what we might call more traditionally the care economy. We've certainly seen that we have been exposed to huge vulnerabilities in the care sector as a result of our historic underinvestment in that sector. One of the things that we've been calling for very strongly is both stabilization of the existing childcare sector, just so that it exists when we come out of this. This is not even expansion. We need to make sure that we have that stock of childcare that is absolutely at risk of closure. And then also significant investment in building it out, because the returns on investment for a childcare-led recovery, that kind of social infrastructure recovery, are massive, both in terms of training up and drawing in a labor force that is usually a female labor force as early childhood educators, and one would hope in a publicly managed system paying them well. And especially recognizing that there are sectors of the economy that may not come back after this particular crisis period, but also in terms of building capacity so that especially mothers can return to the labor market, can engage in the labor market, and can increase their hours in the labor market. The thing that we know is that for every percentage point increase in women's labor market participation, there's a $1.85 billion GDP return. So the returns on investment for women's labor market participation are significant. The choke point is childcare. So it is a smart investment in the immediate term, it's a smart investment in the medium term, and it is the kind of thing that will increase our overall, not just GDP heft, but our capacity to weather the kind of care vulnerabilities that we've experienced. I think the other thing, and I'm going to share this because this audience is also obviously really interested in the sort of entrepreneurship and in small businesses. My spouse is a small business owner. I've spent the last 13 years as I don't know what I'd call myself, a co-fretter. I'm a worrier. I pace about it. I have very limited skills in terms of actually assisting with the day-to-day. But certainly for especially small businesses, having their employees have access to reliable, high quality, affordable childcare is incredibly important to their capacity to keep, to maintain, to promote the kind of team that they want to put together. I'd also say that one of the things that I am really interested in this moment is that the Ontario Chamber of Commerce recently released a report on what they're calling the she-covery, and they unusually, for that organization, called for a significant investment in early childhood education and care and the building of a national childcare system, recognizing that it benefits all of us. It has this GDP heft, but it's also really important to small businesses. And just as a final point for the small business audience, design really matters, and I'm happy to talk about the design of childcare policy. But one of the things that is always thrown into the mix in our conversations about childcare is, well, why don't businesses provide childcare? How can we encourage businesses to be childcare providers? And there are very few examples of businesses that are able to do that. And if they are, that's great. But the reality is that 75% of firms in Canada have fewer than 10 employees. So just doing a landscape survey of what it looks like to be a business owner and an employee in Canada, you're not in a kind of workplace that could, under any circumstances, summon the collective resources to be able to do that. So it also underlines it as a really important public investment and public good that supports small businesses, especially, to do the kind of work that they're doing such a good job doing, especially in these difficult times.
Ooh, yeah. So I feel like you've explained to us why, and the chamber as well, has talked about this. You just mentioned the chamber report, the returns on investment being massive, the practical, logical reasons why these are important conversations to have. And yet when the topic comes up about childcare, about social infrastructure, it seems to be that the conversation pivots to be focused on women, only of interest to women, and really deflates to become a personal problem, where instead of a policy problem, which is what you're talking about. So you're a sociologist. How can we get people to care about this topic and this lens of policy as a solution? And what can we as women in Niagara and as small business, the GNCC, WIN Council, what can we do to support that kind of change in tone?
Absolutely, and Julia, that's such a great question, and it's a perennial problem. We always think about, especially, and it's sort of shocking if we take a step back and look at it. We always talk about the care of small children and these little tiny vulnerable humans as this individual thing. Like there's no social or collective responsibility for investing in them and supporting them and growing them, when we know this is when their brains are doing the most growth that they're going to do in their whole lives, right? We have a very high tolerance in Canada for child poverty, and historically we've had a very high tolerance for child poverty. And in the last half decade, we've seen some reductions in child poverty as a result of very targeted tax credit investments, but we still have a very high tolerance for child poverty. We have high rates of child poverty in Canada. So what it's always a kind of funny conversation, because of course it is deeply personal. This tiny human is in your life and you want to make all of the right choices for them. But we also have a culture that is very comfortable blaming women for having children, for the choices they make when they have children. They get blamed if they have their child in childcare. They get blamed if they stay home. We have a culture of kind of overwhelm, right? That we expect most mothers to be excellent in their labor market attachments. They should be able to whip up, a 47-tiered cupcake spread with sprinkles. They should also, have their nails done and be perfect parents and so on. So we have created and bought into all of this. And as part of all of that, we as a culture tend to individualize responsibility and also blame, right? So we also think, well, if I can't do it all, what's wrong with me? I need to do more yoga. I need to read this one, I need to read this book, or Oprah needs to tell me, or whatever. So there is a way in which the kind of logics and of what really came out of a kind of neoliberal logic, right? Like, if you couldn't make it in the labor market, what were you doing wrong? You should be trying harder. We've individualized that also in our parenting and in our work life. So it's not surprising that consistently emerges, right? We don't say about public school, we shouldn't invest in this, and this should be the parents' responsibility. We recognize that we have a significant social interest in an educated, a happy, a socialized, an athletic, pursuing interests population that, by the way, these are the people who are going to be taking care of us. We're going to need them to be working and paying into the healthcare system, the long-term care system, childcare, education, and so on for us later on. So we have a funny bifurcated thinking about small people. I think that I am of the school of whatever gets it done is useful. So at different moments, it's been really important in talking about childcare to talk about developmental, child development. It's been really important at various points to talk about human capital outcomes. I think right now what most people recognize, and if you're sitting down and having a conversation with your extended family members who might not necessarily think it's a good idea to spend more money in social policy, I think right now the argument that is the most compelling is the economic argument, the return on investment, the kind of stabilization of the sector, the absolute importance of keeping women in the labor market. Mothers' incomes make up over 40% of household spending power. We require that spending power. Household spending is a huge driver of the Canadian economy. We can't take that out. We can't replace it with anybody else's labor. We need those women to be spending and to be paying the mortgage, to be paying for food, to be buying food, to buying Christmas presents and Hanukkah presents at the local small business. So all of that social architecture that we need to have in place, keep in place, and then build out is in all of our interests. And I think that's a shift in conversation. And I think the economic argument is the one right now that I think most people can most easily understand. But of course, there are other really important elements to this, and not least of which is how do we assess ourselves as a society when we say that we don't think that there is a significant role for public investment and public management of the most vulnerable humans among us, and the most vulnerable humans who, some of whom are arriving at school at school age with some really significant needs that could be addressed earlier, that could be supported earlier, that families who could also be supported earlier. So I think there's an art of the possible moment right now, and I would say that most households are not looking at the Constitution and saying, oh, if I'm upset about childcare, I should be really mad at the provincial government. They're whoever they see, if it's their ward councillor, if it's their federal MP, they're saying these are supports that we need. Childcare is unaffordable. I've been on a waiting list for 2 years. I can't get a subsidy. There are no spots near me. All of the landscape that we know. Nobody's thinking about what are the jurisdictional issues there. And I think that in fact, federal governments, provincial governments, territorial governments, and even municipal governments are very vulnerable on politically vulnerable on not supporting building out a childcare system. And I think now is the time. It's also, by the way, December is the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, whose chief recommendation was a national childcare system. So we're overdue.
It's a good point. You're totally right. I think that's something we need to bookmark for WIN Council. So you've given us, there's the economic logic, there is the social and moral imperative, there is also the rationale to, raise future generations that will take care of us. Lots of entry points into this conversation for people to care about. And I hope that at the very least, we've empowered our participants today to find their entry point into this conversation and to think about it. And I want to make sure that we let folks know that we'll make your links to your research and to some of the articles that you've written on this topic available, because I think, like we've talked about, it's very important. It's very timely. This is an opportunity in so many ways. This time, this pandemic is giving us time for reflection, time for thought, time for critical conversations, and to do things differently for the future. So it's time to have this conversation. We're happy to facilitate it. And on that note, I see that Ruth has raised her hand, and I think we're getting some questions in the chat. And I'll just say one comment. I think it's a comment, maybe not a question, from Ashley Doyle. How is this not a no-brainer, right? Interesting. So Ruth, I want to call on you. It looks like you've raised your hand, and turn it over to you to ask a question. Or if we can't get you there, Ruth, then if you want to type it in the chat, I'll be happy to ask. Maybe.
I don't know. Well, let me answer Ashley's question at any rate. This is not a no-brainer. It has been a political hot potato for a really long time. Family policy is really personal. And I think one of the things that is really challenging about childcare in general is that it takes a while to build the capacity. So we only have capacity in Canada for about 27% of 0 to 5-year-olds right now. I mean, so we don't have a childcare system. We have a childcare patchwork. And so it's hard to get, it's really expensive. So you can't see the returns really quickly. And so when people are, sitting there struggling, trying to figure out, how do I take care of this small human? One of the logics that is often really tempting is to say, let me give you cash. And many governments, historically, and certainly in Ontario, this has been a strategy recently, but in most jurisdictions, it's been tried. And, you need money, it's expensive. Focusing only on affordability is a problem because it doesn't build a system, right? So I can give you $6,000. Here's $6,000 for you to go and buy childcare. You're going to buy the cheapest care you can find. And by buying the cheapest care you can find, you're going to stimulate low-wage, female, insecure employment where there's high attrition and it doesn't build a system. So you by doing that, you address one part of the affordability problem, but you also contribute to the kind of insecurity and precarity in the system. And you absolutely guarantee that the woman who's getting paid $6,000 is not able to pay for childcare for her child, right? So that, so I think that it's a difficult policy landscape because it does take time to build the capacity out and to get where we want to get. I would like to see 70% of kids in Canada having access to high quality center-based affordable care. So that's a big distance to bridge. We need to, we need to build the roads, we need to build the centers, we need to retrofit the schools, we need to hire and train the ECEs. It's not going to turn on a dime. And of course, we need to fund it and publicly manage it. Those and all of those returns that we've talked about will accrue over time. But I think politically, when we say, is it a no-brainer, I think it's easier to run on, here's $6,000 than it is, it's going to take us 5 to 8 years to build a system that will cover 75–80% of kids in Canada.
And that's if you can find somewhere with your $6,000 to place your child safely, right? And I just want to go back to say, this is what you're talking about. when you're talking about social infrastructure and building that, and that recovery being focused on the impacts of this recession, being that's the social infrastructure. That's what we're talking about. So it looks like, Ruth, you are here. Are you able to ask your question now? I see your name. I'm going to ask you to unmute and see if that works. Okay, Ruth, can we hear you? Oh, I heard something. Maybe not. Okay, I'm going to go to one other question, then we'll come back to you again, Ruth, and hopefully we can figure this out for you. Oh, I see her. See her, exciting. Okay, can we hear you? No, we can't hear you.
I'm very sad.
But it's great to see you. No, we can't hear you. I'm not a great lip reader either. Actually, it's one of my worst skills. I'm terrible.
I'm really good at charades.
Perfect. Maybe we'll take that approach for the next WINspirational, folks. Charades, only if you're coming back, Kate, because that would be fun. So I've got one other question here, and Ruth, if you want to type it over, if we can't figure this out, I'm happy to ask for you. Kate, you talked about your experience and using your passion and your interest and what you saw in your life experience to drive both your education and now where you've been focusing your career. So how can we better support women exploring those career options? The question also comments that she sees gaps in mental health support, mentoring, and obviously, as we've talked about, childcare. But how can we better support women exploring their career options like you've been able to do?
You know, it's a great question, and I wish I had a super easy roadmap. I mean, I have benefited from working with some incredible scholars and policy researchers and political activists. And I don't, I wouldn't say that I was directly mentored, but I watched them really carefully. And I learned a lot from the kind of relationships they forged, from where they said no to things, from where they got grumpy, and from also their own self-reflections about exactly what I was talking about before, about the overwhelm, the kind of ridiculous expectations that we, that are broadly experienced socially, but that we also place on ourselves. And that really forced me to confront that a little bit, especially when my kids were really little. So I think that there's, I'm always mixed a little bit on mentorship because it can put a lot on the mentor and the mentee, and it may not necessarily be the best fit, but creating opportunities where you bring people along for an experience. If you are going to a conference or presenting at something, or there's a webinar that you're really interested in, make sure that that information is shared. It might feel intuitive to you. And also things like, it is a great, the best experiences that I've had have been the kind of volunteer board experiences that I've participated in, where I can have massive policy knowledge and I can completely understand the regulatory dynamics of, the Ontario Labor Code or whatever. And then you sit down and you work in a second stage women and children's housing center, and you understand that everything you thought you knew as a 22-year-old doe-eyed policy student was ridiculous and you should absolutely throw it out, and that policy is only as good as the ways in which it doesn't work, and that good policy always has to be looking to how to revise and how to attend to the lived experience of those particular policies. And also crucially, and this for me was probably the most important early lesson, how do policies intersect? People don't live their lives like, oh, I'm going to live this portion of my life as federal income tax, and this portion of my life is going to be, provincial healthcare, and this is going to be a municipally or locally run health network. That's not how people live their lives. We don't experience our lives as policy silos, but we practice policy as policy silos. So how do we think about interactions in those policies and how people actually understand and navigate them. And I think for me, that has been a really important animating part of it. So I'd say that, it's also, if you are in a not-for-profit, or if you're in an organization, or if you yourself are somebody who does volunteer work, bring younger women especially along to those, and they can also figure out, what they don't like, right? Because you sort of know what you don't know. You need to figure out how to sift direction and information. And I'd say, in policy terms, I would say right now, I think this is, we're talking a lot about childcare around kitchen tables. We should be talking it around boardroom tables. We should be talking about it around these coffee tables. We should be talking about it at municipal council, at regional council, at the provincial level. I'm really concerned that right now Ontario has, done its statutorily required review of its Early Learning Act, and it's proposing some pretty significant changes that will increase the number of kids in rooms and increase ratios. So in pandemic, when we are experiencing childcare centers actually closing, where they're operating at reduced capacity, where it's not clear that the childcare sector will even be able to survive this pandemic and what may be a future shutdown, we're facing a situation where there's a bit of a tone deafness at the provincial level, at least in Ontario, around those kinds of revisions. And I think I would say right now is not the time to be undertaking significant changes to those ratios in childcare. I think we need to keep our eye on the prize, get through this, and get to the other side.
Okay, thank you. We're going to give Ruth one more try here. We've got just a few minutes left. Can we hear you now, Ruth?
Testing. Can you hear me?
There's
Yay! Yay, you can hear me. First of all, Julie, thank you so much for your lovely words at the beginning. And yes, everybody go get your boobs checked, or check them yourselves. You can do it right now if you're off camera. And Kate, always lovely to see you and hear you, and always so inspiring. I wanted to sort of go where policy and politics, obviously they intersect. And you mentioned that it's going to be 50 years since the Royal Commission came out with their report on the status of women and said that, perhaps a national childcare policy would be a good way to go. And there just hasn't obviously been what I've seen to be the political will. And there's a lot of, we talk about women's issues, and there seems to be a gap when it comes to political will. I'm wondering what your opinion is on term limits, and if term limits would have an impact positively on some of these policy changes and the social infrastructure that we would like to see. Because it seems to me that one of the reasons there isn't political will for it is because it's, a heavy upfront investment. And so when you're looking at perhaps a 4-year term, your base, your electors may not have that. You may not have that will because you don't think it's going to be popular down the road. So I'd really like your opinion on that.
So are you asking if I think that there should be term limits, or there shouldn't be term limits?
I guess I'm asking if you think there should be term limits, because right now there isn't. And I'm wondering, to me, it seems like if there would be term limits, you'd be looking at, okay, I've got 4 years, or I've got perhaps 8 years, and that's it, to push the policy that I see is better for our community, province, country, whatever it is.
I mean, I guess I'd say that, in many jurisdictions, there are actually fixed election dates. So that those exist. You have to call an election within 5 or within 4 years. It depends on the level of jurisdiction. And there certainly isn't a limit in the sense like we have in the US, where a particular leader, the president, can only hold that office for 2 terms. We don't have that. And that would, Julie and I probably will have like a little nerd fest here. That would fly in the face of Westminster tradition, But I do think that one of the things that I think you've touched on that's really important is the question of political will and the sort of patience for building. One of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot in pandemic, because I keep getting this question, and it's one that goes something like this. We've had governments who are pro childcare and they haven't been able to get it done because they've run on it and they didn't get reelected. This only polls really well for parents when they have really little kids, and then it's not a huge driver when we poll people on the factors that will influence their vote in an election, so that it doesn't get a lot of political traction for governments, and this is why we haven't done it, and so on. And I've thought about this a lot, and I actually think that's a really crappy way to think about it. And it desperately underestimates women's solidarity with one another. It desperately underestimates family solidarity with one another. It doesn't even talk about grandparents who may also be significantly interested in all of this. Where it polls in your sort of list of things that are really important, if you get a Leger poll and it says, let's rank, pandemic, can I breathe the air, and then childcare, and the big topic of the day is deficit. Childcare probably isn't going to, in that kind of poll, rise to the surface. Does it mean there isn't a political appetite for it? I actually don't think it does. I actually think it's kind of a dude interpretation of those polls and those priorities. And I think that, I look a lot to the Quebec example, and there are a lot of things to criticize in Quebec in terms of the kind of challenges that they've had with various policy portfolios. But the Quebec government decided in the mid-90s that they were going to invest in a really comprehensive family policy. And that included changing their parental leave policy to make it much more generous and much more accessible, to include use it or lose it paternity leave for a second caregiver, usually fathers. And of course, to build out an affordable, accessible, publicly managed, and working towards uniformly quality early learning and childcare system. And the result of that combined has been massive. So we see in Quebec that women's labor market participation from 1997 to 2016 increased 16 percentage points, even wrote down the number. So it went from 64% to 80%, whereas in the rest of Canada, over the same period, without that investment in comprehensive family policy, women's labor market participation rates increased 4 points, from 67 to 71%. And of course, this has huge, all of the returns that we know in terms of the financial side of the financial and GDP side of things, but it also has really significant implications in terms of women's labor market prospects, in terms of their advancement, in terms of their and their children's lifetime risk of poverty, in terms of the kind of spending that you do in other areas that are really about dealing with poverty. It has all of those other effects. So it's an investment that actually, over the long term, is really beneficial for the state, for the market, for small business, for the people who are using that care, for the people who are employed in that care. But it takes that patience and that concerted determination. And I think that there is a growing impatience with not doing it, and the kind of it's your problem, fix it yourself arguments that we've heard for a long time that just don't cut it.
Yeah. There's so much more that we could have a whole nother session on this. And I just want to note the time. We are over time. I don't know if you have another minute, we have one more question that I want to ask. And I think it's a good kind of summation of a lot of the things you've given us to think about as takeaways. So we know you've touched on this, but can you mention again for us, what are the factors that are hindering universal childcare policy, and what actions we can take to support this kind of policy coming in?
A great question. I think one of the key variables that has impeded the implementation of a universal childcare policy, of course, has been political will. I think it's also been, it's a benefit and it's a real challenge that we have such a decentralized federation. So childcare is provincial responsibility. The benefit is we have provincial experimentation. We can look at Quebec, we can look at British Columbia that has developed this $10 a day pilot and is going to make it much more available to people because the NDP government was recently reelected. We look at Newfoundland that is doing a $25 a day pilot. So we have this experimentation subnationally that we can say, there's some stuff that we can scale here, and that's good. On the other side, we have the problem that we have this variation. So where you live determines what you get in childcare, and in pandemic will determine your labor market prospects and your labor market return. So that unevenness is a huge problem. I'd say that it requires upfront investment, and it has been difficult for provincial governments to sustain that investment over time. This is why I'm in part quite cautiously optimistic about the announcement in the recent throne speech about an appetite for sustained year-over-year investments in building a childcare system rather than amplifying the kind of patchwork childcare market we have, so that when we come out of this, and we will come out of this pandemic, this recession, we don't end up with an uneven gender regressive recovery, so that if you live in Alberta with a not very mature childcare system, you have poorer prospects than you do in Newfoundland that has a more articulated childcare system. So I think there's an opportunity to do a kind of evening of both system building and system outcomes that will have benefits across the country. I think what can we do, what can be done to support these policies? Bring it up wherever you can. Keep talking about it. Keep it on the front burner at all levels. And it is, I really mean it. Like, I mean, talk to municipal councillors and ward councillors and provincial MPPs and federal MPs. Talk about it in all of your meetings. Talk about it as the lever, the magic bullet, whatever you want to call it, because it's long overdue, and it's going to get done what we need to get done now and get us to where we need to be in 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that this is a topic that has been on our list of really important priorities that we need to pay attention to as WIN Council. And going forward, we'll make that commitment to continuing to having that conversation at our council meetings, at our WIN Council meetings. And I know that it's something that the Chamber, as you mentioned, the Ontario Chamber is paying attention to as well. So we're going to do our part and keep talking about this issue because it's so important. So again, I want to thank you, Kate. I want to thank all of our participants for listening in. I think we delivered on the promise that this was not going to be a boring policy talk. This is real interesting, really important stuff that impacts all of our everyday lives, as you described. So thank you again for making time. I also want to thank our sponsors, BDC, Business Development Bank of Canada, and remind you that there are many resources out there from BDC for women entrepreneurs, women starting businesses, women getting back to work. So be sure to check out some of those resources, and also to direct you to Rock's website to connect with Kate's research, and we'll also make sure you have access to some of that information as well. Up next for WIN Council, we have our Women in Business Awards coming up in November. So we hope that we will see many of you back for that event. Watch for that on our website soon. And we're going to continue having these conversations. They're not always going to be fun and light and easy, but that's because nothing is right now. And we have a huge opportunity to do things differently, to do things better for our women in business, for women in their community, and really for everyone that we love and appreciate and want to support. So we hope that you'll continue to join us for our virtual WINspirationals and look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks again, Kate. It's been great to connect with you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks for the opportunity.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.